Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Black empowerment starts with you. We've said it for over a decade, but it's true. I started doing this for the same reason a lot of us did, because I didn't see anyone in my immediate vicinity doing it, and I got tired of waiting. It's no coincidence that you see the new voices of black media. There's a lot of us who saw what was happening. A lot of us who could have gone to work at a network or a newspaper or publication. It reminds me of the late great Paul Mooney, the godfather of comedy. He wrote material for all the greats of the last 40 years, from Richard Pryor to Eddie Murphy to Dave Chappelle. Paul himself was hilarious, yet most people hadn't even heard of him. He could have easily been bigger than he was. He could have had the Steve Harvey kind of success. Except Paul wasn't willing to stoop to the level of a Steve Harvey. Paul wasn't willing to compromise his integrity. The white supremacists in Hollywood didn't have enough money to buy his soul, and even if they did, it wasn't for sale. Paul was a career comedian, and yet you'd never see him dancing a jig with Hillary Clinton or Ellen DeGeneres. There's a lesson in that for all of us. We say the word unity a lot, perhaps a tad too much, but to the extent that black unity is useful, we need to understand what unity actually is. Unity isn't something that only occurs whenever George Floyd is murdered, or when Jacob Blake is nearly shot to death and paralyzed. Unity happens 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It happens when we're calling out white supremacy. It happens when we're putting our heads together and planning. It happens when we put bootlicks on notice, like Deborah Martin Chase, the producer of that blasphemous Harriet parody. Shout out to Black Dollars University on that one. It also happens when we form co-ops and are building, because unless you're creating things in the physical world, then you're not building. At best, you're planning. And we need to be frank about that. The definition of black empowerment is not an easy thing, and it shouldn't be. There is no law that says our people have an absolute right to remain on this earth. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke said, no generation's future is secure until that generation makes it to be secure. There's no getting around that. Black empowerment must be more than a habit. It must be a lifestyle. I don't mean in the Oprah Winfrey kind of way. I mean in the same way that a devout Muslim turns to Mecca 5 times a day to pray. When it's like that, that's when you'll know people got serious about black empowerment. And before you say, well, that would never happen, keep in mind, 15 years ago I had people saying that where we are right now would never happen. By the way, the naysayers, they've been silenced and ignored. When a group is facing an existential threat, they tend to lose their patience for the whiners and naysayers. Our biggest liability as a people up until this point is that we're consistently inconsistent. Yes, we can focus, but not for long. Now, with other groups, they have their leadership class, and this is always the merchants, who make it a point to stay focused no matter what. The rest of their group may goof off or otherwise give in to distractions, but that's okay because they're the rank and file and not the leadership. But those merchants, that leadership class, they don't do that. I've often told you about the book Gideon's Spies, which chronicled the origins of the Israeli Mossad. Although the story is surely more complex, the typical way the Jewish writers tell the story is that Jews in what was then called Palestine went to the Wailing Wall to pray in the early 20th century. Back then, Palestine was still a British colony. According to the story, the Jews suddenly came under attack by rocks and bottles being thrown by angry Arabs. A lot of Jews got injured. Later on, the Jewish merchants got together to discuss the incident, and they agreed that the entire problem was that they had no forewarning of the attack. One of them allegedly mentioned that since the days of Solomon, the Hebrews had always relied upon cultivating intelligence on their rivals. Those Jewish shopkeepers and merchants, they decided that they would dedicate their resources to cultivating just such an infrastructure. They made a priority out of it. They didn't need everyone to get on board. They just needed a critical mass with enough resources to get the job done. Keep in mind, this was 25 years before the Mossad was created, 2 decades before Israel was established. Jewish businessmen would set up places to be used basically as supply depots, if not their own businesses for the purpose. They had made up their minds that Palestine would be theirs, one way or the other. That decision was made long before World War II. After the war, the need for a secure place for Jews where Europeans had no power was inarguably clear. They needed an armed Jewish infrastructure to protect it, though, but they didn't have to build one from scratch. Zionist power was already well established there due to the previous 20 years of businessmen bribing British colonial officials for information and paying Arabs to inform on one another. The Jewish merchants made it a point to learn as much about their Arab neighbors as possible. They became experts on them. They practiced Jewish solidarity every single day, and that was crucial. Starting in the mid-1940s, the British had been making it increasingly clear that they were going to pull out of Palestine. The sun was setting on the empire, and they didn't need it anyway. As the end of British rule was becoming a certainty, tensions rose between the Arabs and Jews in the area as to who would be in charge afterwards. When the U.S. and Britain were fighting the Nazis in North Africa, Jewish supply sergeants and property masters would accidentally misallocate materials or lose paperwork on weapons and armament. But a lot of those weapons would later wind up turning up in the hands of groups like the kibbutz and the Irgun. They're often referred to as a militia, but in reality they were privately funded terrorists. It was the Irgun who blew up the King David Hotel in 1946. 91 people died, many of them Jewish. It was the first such bombing of its kind in the area's history, though of course it was far from the last. When the Zionist founders of Israel declared that they were laying claim to Palestine, 5 different Arab nations came against them later the same year. Now, how did they beat 5 different countries for a fledgling nation that had only just been recognized a few months earlier? They had been developing an unbreakable ideology of unity. That's how. And after the Holocaust, that became Holy Writ. All the groundwork of the last 20 years, every day creating information networks within the Arab community, getting Arabs to inform on each other, training their militias regularly, even their women, all these things would come together in 1948 when the Arabs invaded. Now, I'm sure this is a very different story than the one that you probably got from the History Channel. The way that the white media typically tells the story of the origins of Israel was that you had a handful of ragtag survivors of the Holocaust who had not a penny to their name and no resources, no connections, just a bunch of poor people standing around and in their desperation saying we need a land of our own. Now, it's an amusing bit of fiction, but it's just propaganda. For decades prior to World War II, there had been a number of Jewish residents, businessmen in Palestine who had resources of their own and who had been using those resources long before the war to train militias. With the advent of World War II, they gained access to more and better weaponry. You don't go from being a ragtag group of disaster victims to a standing army able to beat 5 different countries on a moment's notice without decades of preparation. The Arabs had the mindset of uniting against an invader, but only when there was a crisis. The rest of the time, the Arabs were typically fighting each other. The Israelis, on the other hand, practiced unity every day, and we still see it in the U.S. A Jewish person will have a Jewish doctor, Jewish accountant, piano teacher for their children. Their plumber will be Jewish. The architect who designed their home and the contractor who builds it will be Jewish. Jewish unity isn't something that only happens when the Tree of Life synagogue gets attacked, or whenever some skinheads deface a Hebrew cemetery. I know that there are some black people who get in their feelings whenever I mention the Israelis. These are people who don't know much and who want to try to pretend that their intellectual laziness and spiritual cowardice is somehow qualifying them as having black pride, as if black empowerment means that you're supposed to be ignorant of everyone else. Let me tell you something. You will not defeat white supremacy unless you know as much as possible about everyone who benefits from it. And that means everyone who isn't black, and a few of them who are. In warfare, he who has the most and best information wins. The Pookies and Ray Rays, whose tiny brains can only handle getting high and looking for hood rats, those guys are incapable of understanding how the real world works. Dr. Claude Anderson explained that we live in a world where groups compete against each other. Black empowerment requires we understand that world and be competitive in it. Other groups study us intensely. That's the reason why we are the only people who buy gas from the Arabs, food from white people, hair weave from the Asians, and Hispanics doing our landscaping, and we buy absolutely nothing from other black people. Show me someone who takes pride in knowing absolutely nothing about the other groups that they're supposed to be competing against, and I'll show you someone who can't even be bothered to learn anything about themselves. To be clear, I'm not saying the situation of the Israelis is or has ever been the same of ours. That would be a lie. What I'm trying to get across to you is that if they had simply stopped at talking about Solomon's temple, then there would be no Israel today. What they read in their Torah wasn't theoretical, not for them. They put it into practice, and they were consistent about it. In the late 19-teens, there was no effort on the part of the Arabs to drive the Jews out, and there was no such effort in the 1920s or 1930s either. And yet, the Jews in Palestine kept to their program, gathering weapons and maintaining an information-gathering apparatus for decades. They did that way before World War II, and they kept at it even without anyone talking about driving the Jews into the sea, etc. And guess what? We can do the same thing. I told you about the 4chan terrorists who attacked the Black Lives Matter protesters in Minneapolis in 2015. These guys were posting their videos online, brandishing their guns and talking about how they were going to attack. Now, a part of the story that doesn't get reported on as much is that a number of black youth have been quietly monitoring these white supremacist chat rooms, listening to these racists, watching them plan their attack. They didn't get into a back and forth with them. These black youth didn't do anything other than observe and prepare. So when those white supremacists showed up, the young people got them on video, confronted them, demanded that they remove their masks. These clowns tried to act like they were actually there to support the protest, but the black freedom fighters weren't fooled. They surrounded these terrorists, hemmed them in, and tore them up. Before they even knew what was happening, the would-be attackers were the ones under attack. Those 4chan terrorists were the ones who wound up being made to disperse. They ran for their lives. In a blind panic, they managed to wound one protester with a wild gunshot, but no one was killed because those black youth took the information and they acted on it. They didn't go to the police. They knew the cops were in league with the terrorists. The video of the thwarted attack became a sensation, and the same police who had helped the 4chan white supremacists to plan and carry out their attack wound up having to arrest them afterwards. All of those terrorists were convicted, and today they're sitting in prison. Now, these were just a bunch of black youth, kids mainly. They weren't FBI or police. They were black youth who had 2 eyes, 2 ears, and brains. They didn't need to ask the Justice Department to do anything. They didn't need to ask any white people to do anything or go to any non-black people for it. They did it themselves, and it worked. We can do whatever we focus on. We can and have done the same things as these other groups. That's why I tell you about the Israelis. To show you we can do the same thing, and we have. What we require is consistency. And that's what this moment of truth is about. An appeal to all of us to undertake a true definition of unity. To buy from our people, to listen to our people, to trust our people, to help our people. Not just when the white supremacists are attacking, but every day. You've no doubt heard that knowledge is power, but that's not true. Knowledge doesn't become power until it is put into practice. Up until that point, it's just information. It's like fuel without an engine. It accomplishes nothing and in time becomes useless. There's an old saying, even if you're on the right track, you'll still get run over if you just sit there. There is something that we all can do to make ourselves into a one-person nexus of black empowerment. That's what I'm challenging you to do. 15 years ago, we saw the gathering storm clouds, and we knew what was coming. At that time, this message was far from the prevailing message among black discourse. A lot of people ridiculed us and said that we were just a bunch of wannabe revolutionaries. But we weren't saying to just read some Malcolm X speeches. We were telling black people the mission had to be group economics because that's the only way you can win a war. Because up until that point, what constituted black discourse was mostly chumps talking about Kundalini energy and synchronizing your chakras. They were gigolos pretending to be scholars, if it can be called that, and they were clearly trying to talk some hood rats into bed. And that was just the few clowns who were trying to pretend as if they were some sort of scholars. They had seen the work of Dr. John Henry Clark and others, real grandmaster teachers, and they figured if I just stand in front of a chalkboard and spout some gibberish, then I can fool people into thinking that I'm as legitimate as these true grandmaster teachers. Well, reality always has the last word, and these clowns have disappeared. We, however, are still here. In the white media, the bootlicks on TV and radio, however, were even worse than those classroom clowns. The black discourse, up until this point, was dim-witted and contemptible. So we made it our mission to elevate the debate. Well, white supremacy went on the march, and the Kundalini con men soon lost their audience. When black children are being murdered in the streets, suddenly nobody gives a rip about synchronizing their chakras. The discussion was serious, and these clowns weren't qualified for a serious discussion. People recognized that and began gravitating towards us. And as white supremacy has intensified its assault, this has become more clear to a lot more people. White supremacy isn't stupid. They know that during a crisis, people find it very easy to put their differences aside. But the white supremacists also know that as soon as the crisis passes, or even if the conditions seem to be improving ever so slightly, a lot of those same people will be only too eager to go back to business as usual. They won't even wait to see if the danger is past. They're just looking for any opportunity to go back to goofing off. Shock and trance, as Obama called it. They know if they let up the pressure on us just a little bit, then there's a lot of us who just can't wait to declare victory and walk away. That's where we stand now. That's where you stand now. I'm proud of the small part that I've been allowed to play in all this, and I'm humbled by your trust and encouragement for all these years. What I ask is, don't just listen to black media, live it. It's important to get your daily refill of black empowerment morale. It's vital. That's what I'm here for. I'm privileged that you consider what I have to say to be legitimate enough and valid enough that you've been listening to me for well over a decade. But the moment of truth is only about 20 minutes a day. It's what you do for the other 23 hours and 40 minutes that matters. Because black empowerment means nothing if it only lasts for a moment. Good day, and be one.